go. Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Accessibility Testing and Reporting, an introduction to the tools, tests, and standards for website and web application accessibility compliance. Long title, I know. My name is Stephen Polacek. I will be leading today's presentation. The usual housekeeping items. We have captioning available today. You can turn that on from the closed captioning button on your main ribbon in the display. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel within a week or so. I did send out the slide deck ahead of this presentation about an hour and a half, 2 hours ago. If you did not receive it, don't worry. I will send it out again when I send out the email with the recording. So you should have that material available to you. If you have any questions, please post them in either Q&A or in chat. Q&A is preferable because that will alert me faster than chat will. I will try and address them when they're relevant to the content. Otherwise, I will get to them at the end of the presentation. With that, let us go ahead and get started. And we're going to start with what are our initial decisions when we decide we're going to do accessibility testing. Great. But there's a lot of thought that has to go into this, because if you're trying to test an entire website, that's a lot of time. When I do testing from my position, it usually takes about 3 to 5 business days to do a good representative sample of a website. So first thing you should ask yourself is what to test. Are you going to test the main? You're going to obviously test the home page, but what are you going to test from down that point as you work through the tree of your website? When we do testing, we'll typically start with the navigation menu items. So in this case, on the example on screen, we'll start on the home page or the main page, and then we'll go to maybe the About Us, the services page, and the products page. From there, you can branch out more. A good way to make this decision is based off of any analytics you have available to you. If you have Google Analytics installed on your website, or if you have something available from SharePoint or whatever hosting service you're using, it's a good way to decide what are your most 10 top trafficked pages would be good ones to test. Another good way to make this decision is based off of things that are commonly getting revisits from users. So any kind of forms, especially a contact us page, or in this case of our example, a user support page for a service or a particular product that people are repurchasing. Those are really good pages to test because they're getting frequent use by the same people. From there, and if you want to, sorry, jumping back to that, from there, you can decide you want to test your entire website. Great. That is a significant time investment, though, so just be aware when you make that decision. Now, what are you measuring this against? There's a number of laws and standards that can affect this. We'll be answering that shortly. But you want to decide what standards and what level of the standards are you going to test against. Third, you're going to talk about what tools to use. You can't just do a single automated scan and call it done. Those scans, they're very useful, especially for finding code errors that a human would probably take a lot longer to find if they're trying to read through all of the HTML forming a web page. But there's a lot of subjective judgment that goes into the quality of some of these accessibility changes, or in other cases, it can't determine the logical flow of a form or a website or reading content. And that's where a user's judgment has to come into play. So there are a number of tools we'll discuss and demonstrate near the end of the presentation. And then finally, we'll discuss a little bit about how often. So testing, like I mentioned, takes time. It can take a couple business days to a couple weeks, depending on the amount of content you're doing, and if you're trying to fix things as you're going rather than reporting them to someone else. You also don't need to do this constantly. General rule of thumb would probably be either biannually or annually, because once you start getting into the mindset of having your website be accessible, you should be working in to your process to make content accessible before you make any changes to the website. So that means once you've done the initial test and you've fixed a lot of the big errors and common errors, and then you can start looking at just maintaining it, because accessibility is not a one and done. You do need to keep on top of it, but if it's part of what you're doing, it should be a lot easier to handle. You might also want to consider, okay, we did our first test, we did our top 10 trafficked pages. We'll do the next one in next quarter, but we'll do the next set, the 10 to 20 ranked pages. And that would be another approach that's really helpful with making sure the majority of your website is accessible. So I mentioned what to measure against. There's a lot of standards out there. I'm going to talk about what applies in Maryland specifically. So in Maryland, we start with the Maryland Non-Visual Access Clause. That's Maryland's own accessibility law, primarily focused on blind and low vision accommodations. Okay, someone mentioned having a sound issue. Can anyone else confirm that they can hear me? You can just post in chat quick if you can. Okay, so it looks like it's just on the one user's end. Either check your computer settings. Oh, okay. Give me just a moment to respond. Okay, thank you everyone for confirming that. Hopefully we can get that, she can get that sorted, but it looks like we can continue. So, as I mentioned, oh great, you can hear now, excellent. So, as I mentioned, the non-visual access clause is focused primarily on blind and low vision accessibility concerns, but it does directly reference the federal Section 508 guidelines. So we also look at those guidelines. They also form kind of the basis for the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. The ADA in and of itself does not have technical standards at this time. They are looking at drafting those in the coming months. But as a working knowledge base, Section 508 is a good place to point to, because it gives you a set of testable standards to work against. Non-visual access clause, again, directly reference those, and then both built on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG, WCAG. If you have any involvement with accessibility prior to today, you've likely heard of these because they are the international standard formed by the World Wide Web Consortium. Those guidelines have multiple publications, but we're going to primarily talk about 2.0 single A and double A, because that is what these other laws directly reference. So that's our working base of knowledge here in Maryland, those three sets of guidelines, which by and large do boil down to mostly the same things. Things like alt text on images, making sure there's feedback for screen readers, making sure there's keyboard only navigation, those kind of common elements you're going to find across any form of accessibility. They do have some specifics. Section 508 has a section about physical device size and location for things like kiosks. The non-visual access clause has a couple other elements specific to Maryland's procurement process and those kind of devices as well, like telecommunication products. So there are some differences to be aware of, but a lot of your testing purposes are going to work off of WCAG. So The nice thing about the WCAG is that they cover most of the common issues we're going to find. So they cover each major area of disability, so visual, auditory, physical, and cognitive. The later editions, like 2.1 and 2.2, also added neurological and speech. Excuse me. So if you want to, please definitely consider testing against the higher standards. Those, as I mentioned, aren't as covered specifically in law, but they are including additional areas in future proofing against changes in the laws. So the more comfortable you can get with some of the higher standards, by all means. The guidelines are broken into 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So the ability to actually engage with the content, see it, hear it, whatever, in multiple forms. There's operable, so being able to use and interface with the website through different means, such as just keyboard, through use of keyboard and mouse, through use of screen reader, through use of voice control software. Then understandable, where content is written in plain language, that any content that needs explanation is done in a manner that is communicated to users with assistive technology as well, where things like forms and such provide proper feedback on what needs to be submitted and in what format, such as like a phone number. And then finally, robust, which kind of covers some of the more kind of catch-all situations regarding assistive technology, making sure everything's compatible, that different browser and tool combinations work, that kind of thing. The nice thing about the guidelines is that they are testable. It is a set of standards that serve as kind of a basis for this. So just meeting those standards, any of them, doesn't mean you're totally accessible, but it's going to cover the majority of situations. And the more of the guidelines that you are satisfying, that means that there's likely going to be less issues and lets you kind of pick out the niche situations that come up, especially if someone has a concern or a complaint that they register. If you take care of, alt text on images, having a heading structure, that kind of thing, that's going to satisfy 95% of your audience. So it gives us that working foundation. The laws themselves, NVA, Section 508, ADA, also give enforcement methods and remediation solutions. So it is a way to have agencies and vendors be able to meet a certain standard, and then also require it. And if they don't require it, give them a timeline and an idea of when that's going to be completed. The guidelines themselves, the WCAG, also provide techniques to satisfy them. So it gives that starting point for figuring out how that applies to a specific situation that you encounter. So the guidelines are written in a particular format, and we're going to break that down right now. So they start with a number sequence. That is the principle, the section, and then the guideline itself. So for example, the very first guideline is 1.1.1, non-text content. So it is the first principle, perceivable. It's the first section under that principle, and then it is the first guideline. And then it's the name of the guideline, and then it's followed by the statement of the requirement. So in our case, it is all non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose except for the situations listed below. That's followed by the particular level. So in this case, it's a level A. There are level AA and level AAA requirements. I've talked about this in previous webinars to a greater degree, but a quick summary is that level A is your real basic items just for making everything accessible. It also handles things that inhibit functionality and usability. So, not being able to move around with the keyboard or a button that is not working, it covers those kind of situations. Level AA is covering kind of more what it makes moving through a website inefficient or difficult or frustrating to use. So things like colorblind or color contrast situations might inhibit the understanding of content, or where a screen reader is trying to use a website form and is not receiving proper feedback or is not told when a page is updating, and a user has to find that on their own. Doesn't truly restrict that functionality, but it does put more on the user, and they might miss things because they're not getting proper feedback. And then AAA, which is typically improved versions of the previous two, or adding additional functionality cover as many disability needs as possible. So one example I like to use a lot is the color contrast requirement. The AA requirement is 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio between text and background. There's a AAA requirement raising that to a 7 to 1 ratio for the color contrast. So that's an example of how you can meet the AA standards, or you can make it even better and hit the AAA standards. There's one for link purpose as well that we'll discuss during the demonstration. And then finally, but most of the guidelines have bullet points under them, providing either specific situations that might come up or exceptions or practices for specific elements. So in the case of 1.1.1, we have the controls input bullet, where if non-text content is a control or accepts user input, it has a name that describes its purpose. And then it refers to a later guideline 4.1 for additional requirements for controls. So it's telling us that if you have, let's say, an icon to use for moving to the next step in your form, because that is now a user control, there are additional guidelines that apply to it and need to be referenced in either in addition to or instead of this guideline. So there's a lot of guidelines. We're not going to go through all of them today. I would encourage you to look through them. Also consider looking at the 2.1 and 2.2 standards. They offer additional areas for those other categories of disability for mobile design and such. So, and then some agencies in the state have already decided internally to meet those standards instead. Like I said, there's no formal push to make it a universal standard, but we are starting to see it become a requirement in some areas. So at some point in the near future, it's a good thing to consider. So how do we use these guidelines? So we have our standards. We have WCAG 2.0, Section 508, NVA. We've boiled them down into each of the areas they cover, what we need to consider. What do they apply to? Because when we hear about this, we really just think in terms of websites, but it applies to a lot more. There's not just web pages. You also have electronic documents on your website, any PDFs, any Word documents, Excel sheets, other kinds of publications you might have. The guidelines can be applied and used to make those accessible. Any widgets you have operating on your website, or internal applications, like you have a registration system and user has an account and they can come in and request services through that. It applies to that as well, because that isn't just a static HTML. That is essentially a program running in their browser that they have access to through you, but that still receives the same guidelines. So that's something to consider, is that it applies to every part of your web page. Even if it's not content originally hosted by you, you're hosting someone else's content, you are still responsible to some degree to either try and make that accessible, either get the original host to make it accessible, or provide an alternative. So These are the things we kind of need to think about as we're testing. And finally, making a determination about it. Is it compliant? Great. That means we can continue on as is, or does it require remediation? And that's when we start talking about like, okay, what are suggested remediations? What's best practice for that? And then in some cases, what do we do instead because we can't make the original solution accessible? So if you need to know more about the laws and standards, I would encourage you to check out last month's presentation, which is what is digital accessibility, that is hosted on our YouTube channel. You can also reach out to me at our email, mdod.nva@maryland.gov, and I will try and explain those in greater depth. For now, let's get into the heart of the presentation, which is the testing procedure, what you're really here for. Let's talk the tools first. So, as I mentioned, there are a number of tools we use when we're doing testing. First thing is your standard keyboard. And for those of you who are in the US, it's probably a QWERTY keyboard, the QWERTY, because that's the first 6 letters on that first main row. If you're using another type of keyboard layout, perfectly fine. That works for you. What's really important is that you have just a standard keyboard and that you're able to use tab and arrow keys for moving around a website without using like a mouse or any other kind of input. Next thing is some form of automated scanning tool. There's a number of them out there. The primary one we use at MDTAP is called Andy because that was created by the federal government, Department of Homeland Security, and the General Services Administration for the purposes of Section 508 testing. So it's a nice tool to use because it really aligns with the guidelines and standards we use here in Maryland. Some alternatives, though, are Wave from WebAIM or Axe DevTools from DQ. Both have free browser extensions. I think for Chrome, they might have it for Firefox. I'm not 100% sure on that. There are other tools out there, though, and they all kind of do slightly different things. A lot of those other tools will use the WCAG guidelines, excuse me, like 2.1, 2.2, with 2.2 coming out later this year. They also will cover things like ARIA use and such. So if you're a little bit more knowledgeable about accessibility, you might want to consider using one of those tools or using both as a cross comparison, because as I mentioned, Andy doesn't quite cover ARIA as well as Wave or Axe, but it does cover the guidelines and the laws, while the other two only cover WCAG. So having that cross comparison between the two kind of gives you the greatest picture of your website. Next thing is to have some form of color contrast analyzer. There are several out there. A lot of them you'll plug in 2 colors and it'll tell you the cross reference or the comparison, rather, the ratio. We like to use the color contrast analyzer or color contrast picker by Level Access. That is a Chrome browser extension. We like it because it allows us to choose, it'll display a grid of color contrasts, and you can choose to change either text or background. Andy does do color contrast analysis, but it'll only recommend changes to the text itself. So we like to give some additional options through the Level Access tool. Finally, you'll obviously need to use a browser. We strongly recommend you try at least 2 browsers because we want to simulate as many user cases as possible. So we use Chrome, and usually we'll try it out on Firefox as well, 2 of the most used browsers in the world. That'll be on Windows, and then on Mac OS, we'll use Safari because that's their most used browser. Occasionally, we'll also include Edge if we either are aware of an issue or if there's a recommendation to use Edge or if it's requested by the agency. But you want to use at least two combinations, maybe a third if you're going to test both on Windows and on Mac, which I do encourage, especially with screen readers, because if you're going to test on Windows with a screen reader, NVDA or JAWS are your two best options. Between the two of them, that's roughly 80% of screen reader users on Windows, according to WebAIM. On Mac OS, your option is really just VoiceOver, which is the built-in screen reader for there. NVDA and JAWS don't function on Mac, and there isn't really anything that is as powerful as VoiceOver on there. I don't honestly recommend using Narrator that's built into Windows because it's just not as powerful as the two options I've mentioned here. And NVDA is free. Technically, they do ask for a donation, but you can just download it and use it for free. And it's a good option to kind of handle most basic testing. JAWS is more used in the workforce and it is more powerful than NVDA, but they're similar enough in control scheme and situational use that as long as you're using one or the other, you're going to cover your bases pretty well. And then finally, mobile testing. And you want to use the native accessibility features that are built into the phone, and preferably you'll use both an Android phone and an iOS phone. There are some differences between the two and how they interact with websites and the strength of their accessibility features, but by and large, again, we're just covering those situations where there might be a difference, but more likely you won't encounter differences unless you have a really complex website, like you're using that account system I had mentioned earlier. Now, our procedure, we break it into 3 categories, and then those have their own little subsections. Our reports are written like this, where you have a manual inspection part, assistive technology testing, and then mobile device testing. This approach has really worked well for us because it gives us a good way to break down what areas and how they're affected and allow us to assign the work between different people rather than just one person going through everything. You can also find what works best for you, how many team members you have, who is going to be trained in what area. I do recommend, though, that everyone learns how to do all of this, just because that way you can cover each other when situations are needed. So inside manual inspection, that's when we do first the automated inspection assistance. So we'll run Andy, we'll run Wave, or we'll run Axe Tools, find the various errors that they find, remove any false positives, or use it to try and find how many instances of a particular issue we find. So for example, let's say there's a form control issue with the search bar on the navigation menu. The automated inspector will find that, but that's going to be used multiple times. So we want to make sure that we're flagging it once and saying this needs to be applied universally rather than listed per every page we find it on, because it's a common control. We also find that a lot with color contrast analysis, which is the third point here. I'm skipping ahead slightly because we're using CSS a lot through our websites, correct? So when you have a color contrast issues on one page, you're likely going to find it throughout your domain because all of your links, or at least in that section, are using that same color scheme. So there might be, 32 instances of that listed in the automated report, but it's really one single problem. So that's where, again, that human judgment comes into play with using that. And then jumping back to the second point in manual inspection, keyboard navigation and visual focus indication. So this is being able to move through the website with tab and arrow keys or moving back with Shift Tab, and being able to visually see where you are through some means, typically an outline around whatever interactive element you're focused on. There are other ways to do this, but that's by and large the most common way to handle it, and making sure that you don't get trapped anywhere. So like content that continuously loads inside a widget, like a Twitter feed, can be really problematic for keyboard users. In the second area, in assistive technology testing, again, the first thing we typically do is screen reader testing. Multiple combinations, as I mentioned, using NVDA with 2 different browsers, using VoiceOver with 2 different browsers. And you're kind of looking for the same thing, but there's also a usability factor here. Testing that you're able to move around a website efficiently, that you're getting proper feedback from forms and controls, and that you're getting sufficient information and good descriptive information that's telling you what you need to know. And then there's also maybe, if possible, getting rid of some minor annoyances like break tags is a big thing. Usually they'll be used a lot to create space in a website, but the screen reader will read those out too. And it'll hear a blank blank and then read the next paragraph. So it's annoying, but it's not truly a problem. But it's something we can report and say, hey, your website would be better for users if you remove those, because it just makes the experience better. And that's one of our goals too. It's not just making it, usable, it's making it a good experience so that they come back. We also look at magnification tools. So something like Zoom Text or the built-in magnification in either operating system works. Most of the browsers as well have ability to increase font size by 100%, 200%. That's another thing we'll typically test. I didn't mention it before because they're usually built into what you already have at your fingertips. And then the third one that we do, and you might want to consider later down the road when you're more comfortable doing this, is adding things like voice control and physical control options. So voice control is built into Mac OS. There's also Dragon, which is a more robust one that is available on Windows. For physical control, that's sometimes different kinds of assistive technology or different keyboards, which primarily more affect the computer, but in some cases it does affect how you interact with some elements in a website. Not really something I would recommend for those completely new to accessibility testing, because it does require some training and knowledge of how to use those particular tools, whereas most of the other ones you can kind of pick up and go, or at least do the very basics. Like with a screen reader, you can use either tab or arrow keys to just read through everything, and then as you learn more and get more comfortable with using these tools, then you can start adding those additional user situations and covering more and more of your audience's needs. And then finally, mobile device testing. As I mentioned last slide, those native accessibility features, which is kind of the same thing from the other 2 categories, magnification, your screen readers, your physical assistant menus. You're also looking at the reflow and organization. So how does content rearrange from that wide desktop view to that narrow, thin, but really long and scrolling phone view? And depending on how that reorganizes or such, that might introduce issues like overflow or cause side scrolling, or sometimes additional content is added specifically for mobile use because the desktop version doesn't have the same control scheme. Or one example might be like a carousel, which now has swipe controls instead of 2 buttons that you see and use on desktop and can click on. And then, as I mentioned, cover both operating systems that are used today. Now, give me just a moment, sorry. Excuse me, thank you. So Now we're starting our testing, but we need to record our results so that we can go back and fix problems, or we can give it to someone else whose job it is to do that. So when I write a report, I have a fairly standard approach. I'll be providing this template to you guys with the email coming later with the recording and such. But this is kind of its basic layout. Is we're divided by those three sections: manual inspection, assistive technology, and mobile testing, and then the area location. So which in each of those areas, it's broken into like domain level issues, so things that are common across pages across your website, or specific to a page like homepage, and then I'll list all the issues we found just on the homepage. We found that this works the best because when people are fixing the website, they find it easier to just fix everything on a particular page and then move to the next one. So rather than try and list it by the guidelines and, making a user try and, or a report, whoever is reading the report, try and follow each of the guidelines, it doesn't work as well, because then they're jumping from page to page to page, or they're trying to figure out which ones go to which page. So that's why we lay it out this way. Another thing that we do that's a bit different from most other report writing in this area is priority level. Section 508 doesn't have this because it's basically a pass or fail. If you don't meet every guideline, you are technically not considered accessible because you're not compliant with the law. The reason we have a priority level is because a large amount of the time we're dealing with information that's already publicly available. So something that's already available outside of the agency. So in those cases, we want to make sure that we're taking care of any issues that inhibit access to that information or comprehension of that information first. So anything that's critical is typically a level A item. And then we have required, which are the AA items, which are things that either inhibit efficiency or make it difficult to use the website, but it can still technically be done. So those are the two things that need to be done in order to be considered compliant with the law. And then we have suggested, which is usually either AAA items where we say, hey, you have a link here that is a single word, like click here. And then it explains, what click here for our newsletter or something. If it's inside the same paragraph tag, that means it is meeting the AA standard. It makes sense in context. But there's the AAA standard where the link makes sense on its own. It doesn't require context to understand where it's going. That's a AAA standard. We'll mark that as a suggested item there so that people understand you're compliant, but you can be better. We also include some of the 2.1 and 2.2 standards in the suggested items. So again, future proofing for down the road when those standards become either applied by law, or internal decisions might move up to 2.1, or in cases where a user complaint comes in or an ADA issue arises and we need to figure out what we need to do in order to fix that. And then finally, concerns, which are typically just other random problems we've encountered during that testing, like, oh, there's a grammatical or spelling error here, or the login crashed when I was trying to use it. And I'll just mark those in the report. They'll just be concerns. They're not typically accessibility problems. It's more just I want to make the agency I'm working with aware this problem occurred multiple times. Here's where it's located. And that way their people can fix it. It's more of a courtesy thing than anything. We'll also cite the WCAG standard that we are using for this test and for this line item, and also provide that way the users, or not users, sorry, that way the agency or the vendor that we're working with has a place to start. This was something that was requested of us a few years ago by a vendor because they were struggling to figure out which guidelines applied or which techniques to use. And so this way they knew exactly which ones they needed to do that would satisfy what we're asking of them. So something really useful if you're providing this report to someone else, so that they have a starting point for figuring out what they need to do to fix it. Then we'll provide a written description of the error and then a subpoint under it, providing a suggested remediation. So, add this alt text to this image, or you need to replace this element type button with a link or something like that. Or in some cases where like ARIA is not functioning correctly because it's not put on the right element. Those kind of suggested remediations, anything that we can think of that should quickly fix the problem. And then finally, if there's any errors in the same location or element, like I mentioned, that button or something, we'll add additional subpoints there saying this element has additional problems and here's what they are, using that same format again. So that should look like this. We have an example on screen here versus domain issues. So again, those things that we're finding across the website as a whole, usually that's things in like the header or the navigation menu or the footer. Occasionally it can be other things, like I mentioned, the color contrast for links, if that's like a CSS rule that's causing problems. Anything that's kind of common across 2 or more pages we'll list here. So our example here is a critical issue because it is a level A guideline. It is the 1.1.1. The company logo on the header ribbon does not have an alternative text description. On most websites, the first thing you'll see in that top left corner is the company logo. Well, if a screen reader uses it, it should be the second thing they encounter, because the first thing they should encounter is actually a skip to navigation link or skip to content link. But that'll be the second thing they encounter. And if they just hear unlabeled graphic, am I on the right website? Or do I need to go somewhere else? Or what is this? Is this a button going somewhere? Especially if it's a link to reload to go to the homepage of that organization. So that's why we need to have a text description there. And since it's going to be on every single page up in that top left, that's why it's a domain level issue. And then our second example is just on the homepage itself, where we have a required thing because it's a AA requirement, 1.4.3, which is color contrast. News article text does not meet minimum contrast requirements. And our suggested solution is one of two things. You can either change the text color to #616161, or change the background to #FFFFFF to achieve AA compliance. In this case, again, that's 4.5 to 1 ratio. Don't actually test those colors. I'm pretty sure they don't actually match, but this is an example, so we're working with it. So that's how a report would look like that comes from us. Again, this is just kind of a starting point for you guys. You can write this out differently if if you're working with someone more informally, or if you're more noting it down for yourself, use whatever notation works for you. Again, those priority levels is more of a way to handle public information. If this is something you're working on that's not been published yet, then don't bother with the priority levels. Just focus on, again, those guidelines that are required by law, and then any best practices or improvements you can make that are suggested. All right, with that, let's get into the testing demonstration. So I'm going to be using a demo page from W3C. And this is their before and after demonstration. We're really only going to use the inaccessible page because that's the one that actually has issues. It gives us a better way to demonstrate testing. And right now I have the Andy testing tool running. So The way this works is that it is actually a bookmark available that injects a JavaScript running thing. And that bookmark is available from GSA from section 508.gov. And this tool has different modules that test different things. So when we're testing, we first can run through the focusable elements. So we can turn on tab order. It'll add these numbers, and that'll tell us in what order are things read. So if I go down to the actual demonstration page, this means 13. I go from this image to this form field, then to these links, and then to these article headings, and then down to the articles themselves. So I can test that. It gives me some accessibility alerts that it mentions here. So it tells me, hey, this form field here, number 14 there, doesn't have an accessible name or associated label or title. So that means a screen reader, when it finds that form field, just says form field, edit. No context for what needs to go there or how you're supposed to interact with it. If it's a drop down, if you're supposed to input text, is it a checkbox, what have you. Well, the element itself should tell you the user that, but they have no idea what they need to input. So those are the kind of issues we'd find there. So you can read through the tab order. I still recommend that you run through it yourself, and I'll show you that after we're done with Handy. But then, it mentions some other things like excessive text, like this is a warning about the alt attribute on this first image, because it is this really long description that a user has to listen to. It's also not best practice because that's a logo. Then we can just look at the graphics themselves. So in this case, it says, okay, there's 56 elements we can run through with graphics. Did I break it? I might have broken it. Hold on. All right, links found. Okay, for some reason this is not running right. Let me try again. Okay, it might be because there's essentially a web page inside a web page. Usually this would list out the different graphics and images, and you can run through them with the back and forward buttons, and it would list the alt text, or if there's another attribute giving a name to it, and read out that description. Then we can run through all the different links that are available. Again, it'll mention elements that don't have an accessible name. It'll also alert you to things that might be out of keyboard access. You should always test that, because occasionally it's thinking that it can't, but you still might be able to, or there's something else that's operating in place of that element. And that's where, again, that subjective judgment call comes into play. It also has another one for just the buttons. There's no buttons on this page, but it will identify any buttons on the page, and again, establish what are their names, what are their functions, that kind of thing that we're looking for. And then it does warn you about ambiguous links. So in the case of like these more links, because right now these are actually images, it's saying there's no accessible name, but it might also warn us that these either have the same reference, or it's not telling us enough because there's no context available. Visually, you might have context, but programmatically you don't, where a screen reader will read it as separate from that. Oh, there goes the images thing. Now it just broke on me. If there's any tables on the website, Andy will provide a tables section. You can see the table itself, and it'll give you warnings about that. If there's no tables present on the page, this won't be here. Structures lets us look at headings. So in this case, there's only a single heading on this page, which is actually outside of the demonstration area. So for intents and purposes, there's no headings down here, which is really bad, because visually we have these headings, but programmatically we don't. So if someone who's using voice control says, select Welcome to City Lights heading, it won't select it because it's not a heading. Or a screen reader tries to use the shortcut H to move from heading to heading to quickly get around the website. And it's telling them that there's no headings, and now they have to scroll through all of the content to get down to elsewhere on the web. That's really frustrating. So that's where that navigation structure comes into play. It's also important to have that programmatic association for anything that looks like a list. Landmarks are a similar thing to heading. That's more of just a programmatic thing, a code snippet that tells a browser or assistive technology this is a different region of the website, and it's another way to quickly move around. Any live regions are things that update assistive technology. It's called ARIA Live. So like announcements that happen on the page, alerts, that kind of thing are live regions that when content is added there, it is read aloud by the screen reader. You can also look at more details such as the page title and page language. Page title is what you see up in the Chrome tab, usually. That needs to be there, it needs to be descriptive. We need the page language. That is where programmatically it tells a screen reader or other assistive technology, we're using English. Now, this web page doesn't have one. So that means the screen reader is guessing what language it is and is going to read into the user's default language. So if there was any content on here that was maybe Spanish or something, the screen reader is going to try and read it as English, which can garble it and make it, either wrong or harder to understand. So that's why those kind of code things are needed. And then finally, there's color contrast. There's a lot to do with these tools. And it tells us, hey, there's contrast alerts here if I mouse over text. So if I go down to here, that tells us that passes. This text passes, that passes. This fails because it's a darker gray and a lighter gray, and then it gives a suggested text color. We like to use the color contrast analyzer instead because that would also give us an option for the background. For the sake of time, I will just show you the menu for that, but I'm not actually going to test it. It showed up on my other monitor. Hold on. Here we go. This is what it looks like. So we can select a foreground and a background color using the eyedropper, and then it'll give us this grid where we can see this is our current color choices. In order to be AA compliant, I can either darken the foreground or I can lighten the background. Or I can also meet the AAA standards by going further into those and adjusting both colors, or just the one. If I continued just darkening the text, I can hit the AAA by keep going that direction. So that's why we like this tool instead. As I mentioned, though, there are other tools that are available, such as Wave or Axe. Wave will add, once it's installed to your browser, will add this run through for your context menu. Axe DevTools will actually open up in the inspect tool. So if I go here and then I go to Axe, this is the free version. So you can only scan just the whole page, but it will, as you notice, it'll run through and tell you, here's all the issues it found. Here, guided issues are things that it says you need to manually check. It will also break them down into critical, serious, and minor, depending on kind of the same way we break it down. If you notice, it's moving up to WCAG 2.1 AA standards. So it doesn't include AAA standards, but it is 2.1 instead of 2.0. And also offers best practices. The paid version offers some additional functionality or just focus on like a single part of the page. But it will break that down by type of issue. And then if I open this up, it will give you an explanation and a location and a suggested remediation. It's kind of the same thing, just a different set of standards it's testing for. So then I want to test with just the keyboard. So I'm going to press tab. You see that gray or black outline around city lights? That's the visual focus indicator. I need to make sure that's appearing as I move through this website. So, okay, it's still in quick menu, but now I've pressed tab, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I don't know where I am anymore because I've lost that indicator. So that's a violation because we don't know where we are after we press tab a few times. So those are the kind of things that we're looking for when we're testing. Now we want to start writing these up. So we have our report right here. This contains some additional information, such as what testing tools we're using. We often put the date or the product name so that we can separate them out and such. We have a breakdown of again how we code our report items. We also link to the guidelines themselves so that again users can just jump right to where their starting research is. And then we break it into those separate sections I mentioned. So we have mobile items, we have the desktop, which is split into the manual inspection report and the screen reader report. So this is where one thing we like to do as well that some people have requested is link to the specific page, just in case it just makes it a little bit faster sometimes. But this is where we would write in like that visual focus indicator. I would put that here, which trying to remember the number. And I'm blanking, so instead I'm going to use color contrast because I can remember that number. Almost always I will have the guidelines open in another tab because there's a lot to remember there, and sometimes it's just a lot easier to go read the number quick. But this is where I would put that 1.4.3, and then since that's a AA, I'm going to mark it required. And then I'm going to refer to, let's say, the more city parks text. It's not contrast compliant. And then I will move to the second line. I will usually mark my suggested remediations with italics. You can do a different method. I would avoid using color just because and then you're either making people use color printing, or someone who's colorblind can't distinguish the two then. So that's why it's nice to use a formatting change instead. And this is where I'd say, change text color to that number that was suggested by Andy. I'm just going to put dashes for now, or change the background color to whatever contrast ratio number worked. If I wanted to, I could also say, so I can also make, I'm just going to put AAA standard. And then I would put change text color or background color to meet standard ratio 7:1. This is where I would put that suggested remediation as a subpoint to this, saying, in order to be compliant, you have to do this. If you want to be better than compliant, do this. And that's where a lot of the suggested items will come up, or they might be separated out there. So that's kind of the basics of how we do our testing and our reporting. For the sake of time, I won't go over screen reader use. I have done so in other presentations, particularly the previous one, what is digital accessibility? If you want to learn more about screen reader testing and such, please reach out to me. I will be happy to set up a demonstration for you. Back to our presentation. There we go. A couple of things I want to talk about before we head off is, if you're working with a vendor or a third-party product, you're putting the responsibility on them to make something accessible then. In some cases, they might not have been exposed to accessibility, or they need help figuring out where to start. And that's where we need to provide the suggestions or additional resources for the solutions. In other cases, it's also they need examples of where the problem is occurring because they might know how to fix it, but they, need to know where and how to replicate it. That's a big part of bug testing with any kind of software or IT solution is how do we replicate this problem and then how do we fix it? So second point here is trust that they're doing it, but verify that they've done it and that they've done it sufficiently. We offer this service whenever we do a test report for someone. We'll say, come back to us after you've completed all remediation. We'll do a validation test and say, yes, you fixed it, you're good to go, or no, you need to do X, Y, Z in addition. Or we'll give extra explanation on how to fix the problem. In some cases, like I'll test out a solution on my end to see if it works and then write it out in what I did so that they can just copy paste that in. For any widgets or plugins, or even sometimes content that's hosted on your site that is not yours, or they've been purchased as part of a solution, they're essentially, you've purchased this website from this vendor, but they've purchased this widget from someone else. That's where this gets more complicated. So as the agency that your name is on that website, to some degree, you are responsible to make sure your content is available accessibly. If it's those third-party products that aren't directly in your contract, or it's something you've gotten from another source that isn't yours, you need to consider what can you do as an accessible alternative if you cannot get them to make their product accessible, or you don't have the access to make it accessible on your end. But you should always try to attempt those issues, report those issues to the developers of that particular area or whoever has created that content for you, if they're a separate entity, because they're not going to fix the problem if they're not aware of it. You can't force them to, or well, force is a bad choice of words, but you can't make them responsible for it because they're not inside your contract. Or they're not part of your business deal or whatever, but most cases they're going to be willing to put in the effort, or at least be aware of the problem and start looking into solutions. But in the meantime, you need to offer an alternative. In some cases, that's like putting data into a separate table or creating another way to handle that issue. One thing we like to do is offer a meeting after if the first validation fails or something, we'll offer a meeting to demonstrate the issues or work through potential solutions, or offer clarity on items that we've listed out and they might be having issues figuring out the solution on their end. That's usually between us and the vendor rather than the agency, but please feel free to do that. But that's a way for its developers to kind of deal with more problematic solutions, or say, hey, we have two ways to fix this, which is better. And so those are the kind of discussions you want to be having. And then finally, draft a remediation plan. This is really useful for the future tests, or just for when a concern or complaint is raised by a constituent, so that you have something in place that'll say, okay, we're aware of the issue. This is our timeline for what we're doing and when we're going to have it fixed. And this is going to be our response to users when it has been fixed, and if they have other issues that arise out of that. Really nice to have on hand, and also for just what you're going to be doing with these reports, because there's no purpose in writing a report if you're never going to use it to fix the problem. Okay, I've been talking directly for an hour. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to post them now. But here's our final thoughts for today. Establish a standardized approach. Answer those questions we mentioned at the start of the presentation. Use multiple tools and browsers. We want to try and cover as many use case scenarios as we can so that we are covering the broadest width of possible user situations and tools so that we're covering as many areas as we can. We're making it the best possible experience. And finally, provide direction with standards and solutions. Don't just say, hey, there's a problem, but offer a way for them to fix it, or offer a way for them to research the solutions that will work. And so that they know, okay, we fixed the problem to a level that is compliant with our law or our standard. Any questions? Oh, there are in Q&A. I apologize. Didn't pop up this time. All right. Okay. We have. Do you have thoughts, opinions about the screenwriter Kurzweil in relation to NVDA and JAWS? I honestly don't. I know of Kurzweil. I have not used it myself. I don't really see a problem with you using it, though. I mean, I do know of it and of its capabilities. My initial impression, though, would be, at least to my knowledge, NVDA and JAWS are more commonly used. So you'll have a better understanding of how most people, or at least the majority of people, are going to be working with your content or your website versus that tool in specific. But if that's what you have on hand, use it, because it's better that you try or you use something rather than nothing. What do you use for the color contrast check? How do you get the pop-up where you could see alternatives to increase the contrast? Okay, so that is a browser extension. So let me highlight control schemes there. So what that is accessible color picker, level access, Chrome extension. This is probably more than you need to put in for a Google search, but your first option should be this accessible color picker in the Chrome Web Store. This is from Level Access, offered by, here's that version. Let me grab this link. I will put this in chat for everyone. So this one is just a Chrome extension, so you can only do this test in Chrome. But once you've done, by and large, your color contrast should be the same across the board, unless you have different settings between computers that somehow affect it. If you have, like, for whatever reason, you have settings in your browser that you've changed, like if you're using dark mode in one and light mode in another. But that's where that is. Once you've just installed it in Chrome, it should show up in your extensions button, which is right after the URL entry in your browser. Under there will be that extension. You can just click it and it'll run from there. In the case of Andy, it's just part of Andy itself. So when I run it, well, I can't run Andy on that. When I run Andy on something, it just has color contrast as one of its modules. And then as I either mouse over things or if I press tab, it will look at color contrast of any text it encounters. So that's how that works. The other tools will also pull up color contrast issues and it will just list them out separately. So I kind of use two, mostly just because if there's anything I visually see that I think might be a problem, like that Free Penguins or more city parks, if I think that's an issue, I'll test it. Otherwise, I kind of rely on the other tools to tell me there's contrast issues in this area. And then I'll retest it with the color picker extension because it's slightly more accurate. And then it also offers those additional alternatives that the scanning tools don't. So Okay. Colorzilla. You were using Colorzilla color picker extension, but I like that this offers visual alternatives. I mean, as long as you're using something, that's great. Because again, some of these things, if they're especially like really close, like you're hitting like maybe 4.0 to 1 ratio, that might be hard for you to distinguish visually, depending on your own eyes and your own color vision. I know mine is not perfect, but you know, so there's some things I might miss that are issues, and that's where the scanning tool comes in. But as long as you're using something you can pick those issues out, that's great. But yeah, feel free to switch. I mean, there's a lot of tools out there. Like out of the ones I've shown you today, those are just the ones I use in my testing. There's a ton that other people use throughout the world. So as long as you're using something and you're covering all these different bases for these different disabilities and guidelines, you're doing a good job. You're welcome for the presentation. Are there any other questions? I've gone a bit over time. And I don't want to keep everyone, but I want to make sure I address any other problems people have. Doesn't look like it. So thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, you can email our group at mdod.nva@maryland.gov. You can also, if you are a state agency that wants to request services, you can submit a ticket through the IT service desk with the subject line IT accessibility request. That will come to us. That's more for formal requests, like you want us to perform a website evaluation. If you just have general questions, please email us. As mentioned, this is being recorded. You should look for the recording within a week, along with the slide deck and that template that I mentioned. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.